Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to a special episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. It's Sunday, September 29th, and we are talking on Sunday as opposed to Monday, and we'll be dropping this episode in just a bit after Noah Slepkov and I, my colleague at JPPI, finished this conversation. But we decided to do a special episode because our episode, which is going to be coming out tomorrow, is going to be the pre-Rosh Hashanah episode, the Jewish New Year. We tried to move away from politics in that conversation, and I think it'll be a good one with Rabbi Yitz Greenberg on the occasion of the publication of his new book, which is kind of the magnum opus, to some extent, of his life career of thinking about the big issues of faith and tradition of the Jewish people. But we felt that after Friday night's events, Noah reached out to me and said, Yaakov, we have to talk about what's going on because the world has changed. And I couldn't agree more with Noah's instinct that the world has changed. And the bombing that took place on Friday night, when about 80-something tons of explosives. By the way, I mean, one F-15I, I was curious what the aircraft were that were used. It was the 69th Squadron of the Israeli Air Force. They fly the F-15I, which is actually the oldest of the long-range aircraft that Israel does have. It arrived here in the 1990s, but it still is a workhorse and can just carry so much weaponry. It's got two engines. It's a two-seater. As opposed to the F-35 or some of the F-16s. But the F-15I really has superior range and amazing capabilities. Each one can carry something like 20 tons. But I'm getting off topic for a moment. Dropped 80 tons on a couple of buildings in downtown Beirut in the Dachian neighborhood, a known Hezbollah stronghold, killing a bunch of bad people, but primarily Hassan Nasrallah, who really is, and Noah was right, and I'll let you say this, Noah, but Noah's like, this is even more than Osama bin Laden, right? This is definitely more than Muhammad Def, because of just who Nasrallah was. So why don't you, Noah, tell us why you felt that Nasrallah is this other level of a terrorist?
Nasrallah was a head of Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is this military country, basically, inside a country, Lebanon, which is basically a failed state. And Hezbollah is very strong, and it's like a very successful militia inside a weak state. So it gave it an enormous amount of power. I mean, clearly it was not only within the governing coalition of Lebanon, but it was also essentially the Lebanese army, for all intents and purposes, on the northern border, on the southern border of Lebanon, on the northern border of Israel. And this was an army that, as you're fully aware, the conversations we had over the past several years about Hezbollah is that it had this massive arsenal and that Israel should expect hundreds and hundreds of rockets across all of Israel during a war, and that this was Iran's main investment. This is the proxy against Israel, preventing Israel from taking action against Iran. And at the end of the day, the last 2 weeks, we've just seen the total evaporation of Hezbollah's strength and the myth surrounding Hezbollah. I mean, if you had asked me, if I've asked you 3 weeks ago if we thought Hassan Nasrallah would be killed in an Israeli airstrike, in the next 3 weeks we would have said close to zero, just because he's just this figure.
Well, I think, I think you're touching on a few points which are very important to kind of just rip apart a bit, or break apart. Is the first is, definitely if you had said to me a few weeks ago, Israel would be striking just repeatedly, boom, 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 after the other. The pager attack, then the handheld device attack, then the cruise missiles eliminated, long-range missiles eliminated, then start to pick off top leaders, continued strikes all across Lebanon, and then the pinnacle being the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, and that you and I would be sitting in our offices or would have had a Shabbat like the Shabbat that we had, where people were just out and about. Yeah, there was a siren at one point because of a missile from Yemen, not from Lebanon. And I exclude for a moment the north of Israel because they're still in a pretty much the same situation they've always been. But the rest of the country, I would have said, no way. I mean, we'd be in bomb shelters. And that hasn't happened. And I think that I don't want to, give, the evil eye, or what we would say an ayin hara, to what might happen, because it still might happen. But it is interesting in of itself. And it makes me wonder, at least to some extent, did we not over-terrify ourselves with the magnitude of the Hezbollah threat? It could be that we did, it could be that we didn't, and I think that will have to come out at some point. I mean, we were terrified, right? I mean, don't forget, a few months ago, people were going, you couldn't buy a generator in this country, right? Because, and it was funny, I was talking to my son on Shabbat as we were walking to synagogue in the morning. We had a friend's bar mitzvah, and I was talking about, exactly this and about generators. And he's like, what is a generator? But anyhow, I mean, you couldn't even buy a generator. People were, again, buying toilet paper. People feared that this was going to be the destroy. We would have no communications and no power. And here we are, and that's not the case. Now, that still might come, and I hope it doesn't. Yeah. But I also think that probably what's more likely is that Hezbollah is really in a state of paralysis at the moment. And that Israel's strikes, which have been one after the other, very consistent at a really rapid rhythm, have really caused them such damage, and that they are really in shock still of what has happened, and more so in shock by the Iranians. And I just want to add one other thing to another thing that you said. I mean, Hezbollah, look, Al-Qaeda, if you take them as an example, 9/11 will always stand out as this horrific, massive terrorist attack, and very symbolic because of the World Trade Center and the Twin Towers and America at the time. Hezbollah, you can't really put your finger on that one massive terrorist attack. But what you can do is, if you really want to go back in time, you go back to the 1980s when they blew up the Marine barracks and there were a few hundred people that were killed, Americans. But you look at consistency over and over and over again. Hezbollah has its fingerprints on so many terrorist attacks around the world, from Argentina to Israel, of course, where they've kidnapped soldiers repeatedly in 2000 and 2006, where they've been attacking us over the last year, where they have been parts of terrorist cells that were discovered at the last second in places like Azerbaijan and Turkey and Greece and Cyprus, all across Europe. They have presence in what's known as the tri-border area in South America, where they're involved in the drug trade and arms smuggling. They have presence in Southeast Asia. I mean, they are a global terrorist organization. But I think what you said, Noah, which is even more important, is what they were created for by the Iranians. They were established to scare Israel, to scare the world into believing that no one should ever mess with the Iranians. And here, in almost one fell swoop, Israel has remarkably been able to undermine their capabilities, and that is going to send a message also to Iran.
Right. I mean, I think if you look at the comparison of bin Laden, or even the comparison of Saddam Hussein, with bin Laden, yes, he was the mastermind of 9/11, but he was pretty much marginalized in terms of he was leading the Al-Qaeda when they killed him, and he had only communication through a messenger, and he didn't have a standing army. It's more like Saddam Hussein's capture, because Saddam Hussein was still, he was governing Iraq. He had no effective control when he was captured. But this, with Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah was effectively the leader of the Lebanese army, the Lebanese militia. He had complete control. He's been running Hezbollah for 30 odd years now. So for him to be taken out in this way, I mean, it's really a decapitation of the leadership. From the starting with what happened with the pagers and, as you said, the communication devices. We basically removed their ability to communicate. We decapitated their leadership, and the reports now that there's some type of ground invasion that's begun. I mean, all this is part of a grand scheme. And you raised the question of, were we afraid? It didn't go that bad. But I think Israel's always worried about the worst case scenario when it plans. And in October, November, December, Israel was really focused on the Gaza war. And it's not clear, after this happened, it could have been that Iran just was like, okay, all out war on Israel. And I think because Israel was still focused on Gaza, it wanted to avoid an all-out war because it would take its eyes off the prize, which was the removal of Hamas, the return of the hostages. So I think Israel waited for there to be basically the end of effective operations. Like the situation in Gaza is such that, no, we haven't returned all the hostages, but we've basically removed the military threat Hamas posed, and we were able to reallocate resources from Gaza to the north and put us in a situation that if all of the pagers and all these operations failed, we would be in a situation to respond. And I think it was a best case scenario. I mean, we don't know what Iran's going to do. It seems like Iran is not going to look for a war with Israel. It's just not interested in a war with Israel. So it seems like we're going to avoid a massive confrontation with Iran. They are sending troops to Lebanon, apparently, but it hasn't, so far it hasn't led to an all-out war. So the situation has been pretty good, what's happened. The response that we'd expect is probably one of the best case scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add a couple other points to what you just were talking about, and that is the point of what changed for Israel, right? And I think that's an important element of the story. I mean, I was on CNN this morning, and I was being asked about, well, isn't Israel now fueling the conflict? Isn't Israel now, taking the initiative? It's no longer acting in self-defense. And by the way, I mean, this is just a warped world that we live in, right? And we have to point this out over and over again because it's just so disturbing on so many levels. I want to take people back for a moment to October 7th, when the greatest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, right? Israel taken completely by surprise, 1,200 people murdered in the worst of ways known to mankind. 250 people taken hostage, 101 of whom are still being held in the Gaza Strip. And the world is horrified like we are. Like, finally, if people needed evidence of the type of monster that lives along our borders, they got it come October 7th. And then the entire world says, Israel, you have the right to act in self-defense. Of course we support you. Of course we support your right to defend yourselves. And then what do? We defend ourselves, right? We go on the initiative. We launch an offensive into Gaza. We start by the air, then we go in on the ground. And then within days, literally days, the world says, stop genocide, stop international war crimes, stop, you're killing innocent civilians. And some people were like, but one second, did you not realize what happened on October 7th? Did you forget the images? And of course the world forgot the images. But then if we needed a reminder, Noah, of this hypocrisy, of this warped and distorted reality and system of values, we got it this week, right? Because for 11 months, Hezbollah has been battering our country, has been striking at our homes. Metula is a dead city. Hundreds of homes have been destroyed along the north by anti-tank missiles. 10,000 rockets fired, pounding Israel. 60,000 to 70,000 people have evacuated their homes, not able to live in their homes because of a terrorist organization. And what does Israel do? Nothing. It stops itself. It restrains itself. It wants to stay focused on Gaza. And then a few weeks ago, what happens? The army wraps up its big military operations in Gaza. We finish off in Rafah. We still have unfinished business, definitely, with regards to the hostages. There's the lack of a diplomatic and political plan to replace Hamas as the governing entity in Gaza. Still lots to do in Gaza, but the military finally can say, okay, we're done in Gaza in the big way. We can now shift gears and move our forces to the north. At the same time, we've replenished our stockpiles, largely due to help from the Americans. And the third piece is that diplomacy has failed for 11 months. Let's be honest, Israel gave diplomacy 11 months a chance, and it failed. So all three of those came together a few weeks ago. So what does Israel do? We start to respond, not escalate, not attack. We finally start to defend ourselves. And what does the world say? After 11 months, right away, Biden and Macron, right away, stop Israel, ceasefire Israel. Where were you guys for 11 months? Yeah. Again, you know, Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews. It's just so, we know it's true. It sits in the back of our mind, but we don't want to believe it's true until it happens time over again. And it just has to be pointed out because this obscene reality where Jewish blood is just so cheap to the rest of the world is something that cannot be acceptable. So that's just one piece of it. The second thing I just want to add to what you were saying is that, you know, Hezbollah, what people have to keep in mind also is, you know, Hezbollah has not been destroyed, right? Hezbollah is still there. They still have tens of thousands of rockets and missiles. They still have some command and control capability. We saw that, by the way, on Saturday when, yes, Nasrallah killed, command bunker destroyed, but they still have the ability to fire dozens of rockets into cities in the north. That's where they decided to keep their focus for the time being. So we have to assume they have the ability to launch synchronized attacks, but they also have significant ground forces. We haven't eliminated the 50, 60,000 fighters that they have who are well-trained and have experience in Syria from fighting there during the civil war and the unrest that was there from the mid-2011, 2012 up until just a couple years ago. And the last thing I just want to say on Hezbollah, because if some people around the world still live in a warped moral existence, and sadly there are many people who do, just look at the images of people in Syria celebrating. The people in Iran celebrating. Some people in Lebanon celebrating, right? This is, and not just Christian Lebanese, other Lebanese. The big story right now with Nasrallah's death, it's not where the world is, oh, we're on the precipice of a wider war. No, guys, no. We are on the precipice of a brighter future. Yeah. That is how this has to be looked at. It has to be looked at that there is a huge opportunity right now to dramatically change and transform the Middle East. And it's not about the destruction of Lebanon. It's about the liberation of Lebanon. That's the real story that people should be focused on.
Right. I mean, there's a huge opportunity right now for Lebanon to reinstate its sovereignty over southern Lebanon. For I think UNIFIL basically failed its mission. As soon as there was any conflict, they just got up and left. I don't think that's useful. But maybe the French and the Americans can come in and take control over what Hezbollah was doing. You know, once Hezbollah has been removed, I think there is a huge opportunity. Even Iran and Syria, like Iran, for example, they want to get back to the, to have some type of deal with the Americans, and they're not interested in a wider war. So maybe there's a way to convince them to just leave Lebanon alone. I mean, the fact that they won't do it by choice, but the fact that they no longer have the ability. I mean, even yesterday there was a shipment from Iran that was heading towards Beirut, and Israel told the aircraft, "Do not land. If you land, we're going to prevent you from landing." And the plane turned around and went back to Iran. You read about this? You saw this in the. So this was a major development.
Yeah, I saw that as well. I mean, listen, Israel. By the way, it's not just the airplane. Israel has also been striking at the border between Lebanon and Syria to prevent the replenishment of arms that would come from Syria to Lebanon. I mean, I think that what we really need right now, and it's an interesting moment in time if we think about it, is real American leadership. And by the way, I would extend that also to say European leadership, although from the Europeans I have much less.
The French.
But the French, I mean, Macron put out this video last week where he's like, all in bent out of shape about what could potentially happen to Lebanon. And I get that there's that historical connection.
Sure. But
not a mention of, this terrorist organization that holds Lebanon hostage. But I mean, but put that aside, I think it's really, we need American leadership right now. And the Iranian strategy, right, has long been to create this, we know now, and it's being called all the time, this belt of fire, but it's basically, forget about Hollywood terms. It was creating a series of proxy organizations, of terrorist organizations, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and others throughout this region, who could wreak havoc, spread destruction and terror, and do the bidding of Iran by undermining more moderate regimes. So Lebanon was the great success. So in other words, if they looked at the spread of the, part of what Khomeini wanted to do back when he established the Islamic Republic in 1979 with the revolution was to spread it into other parts of the Middle East. And the great success has been Lebanon, where it has pretty much effective control of the country. But they have put forth still this, facade of that there being a democratically elected government, which we all know is not real. But that was really what they wanted to do, and they tried to do that with others as well. And they've tried to undermine. Look what they're trying to do in Yemen, and they've tried to undermine Bahrain, and they, have done stuff also in Egypt, and of course with Hamas, Sunnis, and Shias even coming together, all for the sake of destroying Israel and weakening Israel. But now that's being chipped. That is now shattered a bit. And that's this unique opportunity that we have. But we need real American leadership to lead this forward, right? Because Israel's options, we can continue to fight, we can continue to undermine, we can continue to weaken them. But for that rebuilding, that reconstruction, for that real transformation that Lebanon needs to go through, that's got to come from the Lebanese, and it needs that real leadership from the Americans and the French.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And and what bothers me actually is that there's talk of ceasefires. They talk about ceasefires, but they don't ever talk about long-term solutions. And like, what's a ceasefire? A ceasefire is like, let's give Hezbollah time to rebuild and regroup, and when it's convenient for them, they'll do some type of attack on Israel, and we'll, tell Israel they have the right to defend themselves, and when they do, we'll tell them you can't defend yourself. They need to say, listen, here's an opportunity for there to be a real diplomatic breakthrough here. Instead of a ceasefire, do something more substantial, where there's some type of something that's beyond a ceasefire, something that's much more permanent.
No, that has real teeth to it also. You mentioned UNIFIL. I remember I was the military reporter for the Jerusalem Post back in 2006. I covered that 34-day war, the Second Lebanon War. The war ended with UN Security Council Resolution 1701. UN Security Council Resolution 1701 was supposed to achieve 3 goals. Goal number 1 was supposed to clear out southern Lebanon of Hezbollah. There wasn't supposed to be Hezbollah there. Goal number 2 was supposed to stop the rearmament of Hezbollah. They weren't supposed to transfer weapons into Lebanon, but we know that they went from having 25,000 rockets in 2006 that can only hit Haifa North to having 150,000 apparently 18 years later in 2024 that could strike anywhere inside the state of Israel. And the third thing it was supposed to do was create this UNIFIL, this upgraded UNIFIL. There had been the United Nations interim force in Lebanon, as the acronym goes, since since mid 80s, I think 2000. But the UNIFIL was really a very weak force, very small. This moved it from just a couple thousand soldiers up to 12,000 from places like Ghana and New Guinea to France, Italy, Spain, real militaries. But also they were worthless. All 3 of those elements of 1701 did absolutely nothing. So Noah, when you talk about a real solution, it's not another UN Security Council Resolution 1801 or 1702. Yeah. No. We need something that has real teeth. We need something that is effective, and that requires, again, back to what I was just saying before, it requires an American role, an America willing. I mean, I'll just add another thing, and I think, I really have a lot of gratitude to President Biden for standing by Israel during this war, his wartime visit to Israel, the 500 plus aircraft that have brought supplies here to Israel, the dispatch of numerous aircraft carriers, the Eisenhower, the Ford, Lincoln, every time there's some need to deter the Iranians. And by the way, I wouldn't be surprised if we hear some announcement that that's happening again today. But look at what's happened over the last few weeks. Every time Israel has killed a top Hezbollah operative, what's the first thing the Americans say? Oh, we didn't know about it. We weren't part of it. I mean, it makes you guys look stupid. B, it makes you guys look weak. And C, it makes you look like you have no role in what's happening here. Now, maybe that's been your decision.
Yeah, no.
That's not good.
The Americans would argue that what they're trying to do is maintain the neutral arbitrator between the sides, that they want to remain neutral, and that by coming out and saying, we provided intel, we helped with the operations, it makes them less of a neutral player. So they want to maintain this,
Noah,
role.
I get that, but I'm sorry. That's not possible, right? There is no neutrality when we are talking about a war between forces of good and forces of evil. And that's what this was about, right? And I also understand where the Americans are coming from as well, because I understand how, Biden, there's just a few months left to his presidency. There's an election in 5 weeks. A wider war does not serve any of those issues or any of those interests. If anything, they want to scale back. He would want to be able to end this war, bringing some sort of stability to the Middle East. It's nothing that ending his term, with stability in the Middle East. But, and I'll add one other thing. Any involvement, any threat, any real red line is something you then have to live up to. And no one, if you've noticed throughout this war, never has President Biden issued a red line. He said, don't. He sent aircraft carrier and said you would pay a price, but never was, if you do this, I will do that, right? There was never that type of wording. And there was a reason for that, because they don't want to be caught in a position where they actually have to do something. But I think that's the exact problem, is that this is a moment. Israel has basically, what's the term? I was never a basketball player. It's like an alley-oop where you you kind of throw it up and you set up the guy to then make the slam dunk. Right. This is what Israel has done for the United States of America, for the world, for France, for the forces of good that still exist inside Lebanon. We're giving you guys now the opportunity to make that slam dunk.
Yeah.
We are small, we are tiny, we are fighting on multiple fronts, but we have done things that are remarkable that now you guys got to take it home.
Yeah, I mean, there's an opportunity here for American leadership to step up and work with the Lebanese, help them instill sovereignty, and put this conflict between Israel and Lebanon behind us. I mean, the joke was always that Lebanon was like the most progressive in the Middle East, and in the 70s, everyone knows Beirut was considered the Paris of the Middle East. And once
I still have friends who tell me they go there from Europe, the best parties in the Middle East, even better than Tel Aviv.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm always surprised when I see these videos, when they showed the video of the Lebanese moving north. The Israelis told them to move north. And I was looking, the cars were all fancy, luxury European cars. And when you look at Beirut, it doesn't look like a backwater village. It looks like a modern city. So there is huge potential here for the sides. I hate to use the dirty word, the P word, but peace is something that we don't really talk about. And I think one of the criticisms you could lay on the Israeli government, yes, like you give them credit, the IDF, the Israeli agencies involved, the prime minister. Maybe another time we can talk about the ministers who didn't approve this. Notably, Smotrich was against this operation.
According to reports, that's true.
Yeah. But the thing they're not saying is we're doing this to achieve peace. We want Lebanon and Israel to live in peace with us, and everything we're doing is because we want to have a peaceful border. They're not saying that. They're saying we want to dismantle Hezbollah. We want the Israelis to come back to their home. But they're not saying what Lebanon would look like when Israel is done. And I think that's the major flaw in this, that they're not giving the Americans, the French, the Lebanese, any type of positive image of what they think it can look like when this is over.
Noah, as we're talking, the IDF has just eliminated Hezbollah official Nabil Kawak, and I'm just reading, he's like the deputy head of the operational board or whatever council of Hezbollah, another apparently preventative security, another top Hezbollah operative. Again, it's this constant keeping up the pressure to
it's full throttle,
really inflict paralysis. Before we wrap up, I want to touch on two other elements which I think are just important, or three actually. The first is, and this is a bit in the weeds, but as you noticed, I'm sure, because I think this is actually an interesting part of the story. You know, I've long believed that ever since this war broke out on October 7th, we dance here in Israel. We move in Israel. I call it the two-step dance. One step is we fight, and that could be fighting Hamas, fighting Hezbollah, doing this, attacking Nasrallah, you know, trying to get back the hostages in an operation, whatever it might be. And then the second step is always the politics of it. So we saw it, for example, a couple of weeks ago when we were on the precipice of this wider escalation with Hezbollah. And as everyone's talking about how, you know, we wrap up in Rafah, we might be moving up north, then suddenly, oh, we're replacing the defense minister. And then that gets shelved for whatever reason, but you always see it's the two steps. It's always there. So what happens now? Netanyahu was in New York because he needed to go off to New York to give a speech to the UN. Personally, I was critical of that decision. I thought it's ridiculous at a time of war when we're already in the middle of a escalation with Hezbollah. This is already after the pager attack. It's after a lot of our bombings of their cruise missiles. It's after the elimination of some of their top officials. Wednesday night, early Thursday morning, it was at the night between Wednesday and Thursday, he takes off for New York, of course, together with his wife, Sarah, because he has to give a speech at the UN. Now, we all know the speech at the UN really doesn't mean anything. And I even pushed back. I mean, I think, of course, the speech at the UN is important. And it's important to obviously explain what we're doing and to lay down a defense for Israel's actions. And I think the Prime Minister does a fantastic job at that. He's one of our greatest orators and speakers. But if you really cared about public diplomacy, then you would also build up your public diplomacy directorate. You would invest the right resources. You would have the right people in their positions. I mean, there's a million other things that you would do. It's not just a speech at the UN. But he goes off to the UN and he gives this speech. And then Friday night, shortly after the speech is given, right, he gives a speech, I think 4:30 p.m. Israel time. At about 6:30 p.m. Israel time, 7 p.m. is when the bombing takes place. So it's just after the speech. And he's in New York. Shortly after that, there's a photo that comes out of him on the phone from like a secure phone in his hotel room. Here's where he gave the order, his office tells us. And then his office starts to try to promote this narrative of his trip to New York was actually part of the deception.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, whoa, so this is even cooler than we thought. In other words, Netanyahu flew to New York, planned the operation before, flew to New York to put Hezbollah to sleep. Because he flew to New York, Nasrallah came out of his one bunker, moved to another bunker, and thought that nothing was going to happen. And that's what got the Hezbollah people to be there. Now, sounds brilliant, right? Really does. Sounds brilliant. Here's the problem. Here's the problem with the story. Yeah. The first is, apparently it's not true. Yeah. And how do we know it's not true? Because
you didn't approve the mission.
Well, right. In other words, number one is what you were just hinting to, is that there was a cabinet meeting on Monday night. There was a cabinet meeting on Wednesday night before he took off, which ended without a resolution. There was no decision to act. There were people in the government who were actually opposed to it. Now, apparently Netanyahu, this comes from sources within the defense establishment, had said, let's wait till I get back. But then what happened was, while he was away, the operational just opportunity presented itself. And Gallant and Herzl Halevi, the IDF chief of staff, got on the phone with Netanyahu and said, listen, we got to go now. Because it was viable. And he, of course, gave the approval, to his credit. But how else do I know it's not true? Is because a video came out Friday night, Saturday morning maybe is when I saw it, came out of Netanyahu at Friday night, after his speech at the UN, in his hotel suite or whatever it was, standing with Danny Danon, Israel's ambassador to the UN, Ofer Akunis, Israel's consul general to New York, and other members of his staff, and Sarah, his wife. And they're standing over a table with a great assortment of different foods and platters or whatever, about to make kiddush. It's Friday night, Shabbat. He was going to be flying back home earlier now because of what was happening. So he says a few words right before kiddush. I hope it'll be quiet. We hope we'll have a quiet Shabbat. And Sarah standing there, I don't know who takes this video, but it was amazing. Sarah says it wasn't, he says, I hope we have a quiet Shabbat. And Sarah, his wife, says, the Shabbat wasn't supposed to be like this. And then he responds, all caught on video, Ze ma sheyesh. That's how it is. In other words, she's upset because the weekend has been spoiled. So please do us a favor. Don't give us stories of deception. The story is you flew to New York, which was fine. You made that decision, right? You could say it was right. You could say it was wrong. The operational opportunity presented itself while you were away. You gave the approval, which was great. Thank you. But don't now make up a story that your trip was part of a deception. No, your trip should never have happened, and you were in America when you should have been here in Israel. So that's number one. And I just think it's important because, again, it fits into that two-step that we spoke about before. War, and then, of course, the politics of the war that are just always there, always they're not even in the background. Here they are on video for us all to see. And I'll just say one other thing, because I know people, they'll get upset at me, and I tweeted something on Thursday when he was or on Friday, when there was a missile from Yemen and rockets from Lebanon. This is before Nasrallah. And I tweeted something, there's all this going on. Why is he in New York? Like, what, and then people are like, why you're bitter, you sour people, you're the chamutzim, as they call the people who criticize. I mean, there's some basic things that are just done, right?
You know where he should have been? He should have been in London, meeting with Moody's, convincing them not to downgrade our credit.
That's a whole other part of it.
Because there was an Israeli delegation there on Friday that were trying to, diffuse the situation. And basically what happened with Israel and Moody's is Americans like the baseball references, so I'll give a baseball reference. Israel was in the major leagues, economically speaking, and Moody's moved it to the Little League. And not only did they move it to the Little League, they said, we're probably going to downgrade you to the Pee Wee League. That's how bad the situation is now, and it's going to affect Israel's economy. And the other thing is with the European airlines that basically all canceled their flights to Israel.
Yeah.
Israelis, as you know well, Israelis love to travel during the holidays, and now I think most Israeli trips will probably be completely canceled because of the situation.
Totally. So, and I mean, listen, there's a million places he should have been, could have been, but this is, just if anyone who's been a Netanyahu watcher over the last couple of years always knows that whenever there's a trip somewhere, it always comes with the weekend. It's part of the protocol of how he and his wife travel. It's just, they could go to Italy, as they did about a year and a half ago, to meet with Meloni, the new prime minister, and the meeting is on Thursdays. So you can say, you come back Friday. No, Friday, there's always a meeting. Always on Fridays, there's a meeting with either Jewish leaders or business leaders. Why? And it's too late to fly back before Shabbat, so you got to stay till after Shabbat, right? That's always going to be the story. The second thing I wanted to say, and this is just going back to what we were talking about before, is again, we need to have tzniut. We need to have humility. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know. By the time people might be listening to this, Israel could be under a rain of rocket fire. We don't know. We hope that won't be the case. It doesn't look like that's going to be the case. Iran could directly retaliate against Israel as they did in April. We just don't know. But there's a need for vigilance, and there's a need for humility, as great as the things that were done. And then the last thing I just want to say, before you wrap us up, Noah, is that, and I'll put that on you, is that there's something startling to an extent when you look at the success that Israel's had in the north versus the way we were a year ago vis-a-vis Gaza. And it's almost as if there are two Israels here. There is the Israel of failed policies and failed leadership and failed intelligence and failed military action, everything that happened along the border with Gaza. And I'll just plug, why not, the fact that I just finished writing a new book exactly about that called While Israel Slept, which is like, how did this all happen? Won't come out for some time, but really looking at just a multitude of so many failures from the tactical level, but up to the political level, which set policies that were just wrong, that we now look back on and say those were mistaken. But you see that, and then you see what we've done in the last 2 weeks, and you say to yourself, one second, how is this possible? How does this all live together, right? How is it possible that we have it's almost two different Israels, two different militaries, two different government policies and political echelons? How are they both doing the same? It's like a bipolar country to some extent. And I think to some extent it is a bipolar country, right? The way we move from grief to celebration, the way we on the one hand are an amazing startup and high-tech country, but on the other hand, we are a country that can't even, figure out how to clean up the streets of the old city of Jerusalem so it looks like the proper tourist site that it should be. I mean, so there's so many different examples that we could give, but I think here what we're seeing from a military perspective is when Israel was focused, when Israel understood the magnitude of the threat, it was able to achieve remarkable things, right? It got the great intelligence over Hezbollah. It was able to get that pager thing. It was able to get the cruise missiles. It was able to eliminate one after the other, chop, 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 the top leaders of Hezbollah. But when they weren't focused, when they were distracted, when they thought there were other ways to deal with the terrorist organization, like buying them off with billions of dollars, as we tried with the Qataris' assistance in Gaza, then we failed ourselves. And I think that it just, to me, actually, the success in Lebanon underscores the failures even more of what happened in Gaza, and the responsibility and the burden that actually still lies at the feet of this current government.
I agree. I mean, I also would look at it from the perspective of Hamas. What Hamas did on October 7th was, the same magnitude of what we've been doing the last 2 weeks. That they were able to do this operation, and it wasn't, it's an issue of creativity. We just didn't think Hamas would do such a thing, that they would attack us the way they did, in a suicidal way of actual assault. But in their mind, they really saw this as the beginning of the end of Israel. That the Arabs in Israel would rise up. I remember on the October 7th, the cries from the Muezzin in Jerusalem, calling for the Arabs in East Jerusalem to rise up, that this would create Israel to be in a war, that it would be all at war with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, with Iran, and that it would weaken Israel. And I think it took until pretty much the last 2 weeks where this, I mean, yes, there's the brilliant hostage rescues that were great, but rescuing 1% of the hostages is great for those hostages, but it doesn't change the overall trajectory of the war. But what we saw the last 2 weeks is actually a shift in the trajectory of the war. And now Israel has to take advantage of what it's done to actually come up with a permanent solution, not just a ceasefire that's going to last a few years. I mean, if you look at the ceasefire from the previous war in Lebanon from 2006, yes, it gave us almost 20 years of calm. But in those 20 years, it was just a false sense of reality, because we knew the whole time they were just arming up to get us. So the military successes were great, but it's time for diplomatic successes and really trying to find a way to actually end this conflict.
We have to translate the military success into a long-term political resolution as well, and that dynamic is always going to be extremely difficult. Noah, thank you for initiating this conversation. It was it's always great to talk to you, and I think that it was definitely important to just try to shine some light on a bit of the behind the scenes, as well as some of the dilemmas as we move, as Israel kind of thinks about what's happening next. And just a reminder to everyone, tomorrow on Monday, tomorrow evening Israel time, midday Eastern time, we will be dropping our pre-Rosh Hashanah episode. I really strongly recommend you check it out. A conversation with Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, really one of the preeminent modern Orthodox leaders from North America, based in Israel now for the last few years, and the author of a great new book, A Triumph of Life, which just looks at the dynamic and the versatility of Jewish belief and thinking, and the way it has changed, and the way our relationship with God has changed over time. And it's just an important lesson, an important podcast, I think, to listen to before Rosh Hashanah, because we got the war and we got the battles and we have the fights, but we also have to think about the soul of the Jewish people, which is just as important for the Jewish People Policy Institute, where we come from. So thank to everyone, and be sure to check out our episode tomorrow.
Thanks.